Michelle?
Daniel?
OG Rose. So today we're going to talk about, I did just a quick little anchor recording that was inspired by a Freudian reading group, a Freud reading group that Dr. Cadell Last holds. If you want to see that, you can find the discussions, and I think I know there's a lecture at first that Dr. Cadell Last does, which is great, and then there's a discussion of people questions
Freud. Right.
on Freud's writings in particular. So this was a particular essay that they're talking about on instincts and their vicissitudes, and it was a really great lecture, really great discussion. At the end, the topic of violence was brought up, and it just started to make me think about violence in general. You know, I think generally speaking, we live in like a less violent age.
Sure.
Which is great. You know?
Sure.
But at the same time, there's like violence. So basically, this recording, I got into this idea of violence that leads to life. So it's a particular type of violence, and I feel like that type of violence we are less in touch with. Examples would be like, I really don't want to discuss if it's right or wrong, but just if we think about the past, people hunted more.
Right.
On average, people were having more children.
Right.
People were preparing foods themselves more.
Right.
Even like hoeing the land, and like there's a type of, so there's just a work of the hand, but there is a greater closeness to the blood of life.
Oh sure.
The bloodiness of it, and yet it wasn't a bloodiness to murder. It's not murderous, but it's still violent in a sense, but it's for a particular reason, to sustain life and to promote it and continue it.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you associate violence with messy and then instincts, and there's this kind of idea that where there's repressed dimensions of the human being that are not let out, part more so of an instinctual, maybe even animalistic nature that is no longer expressed. And it's interesting, I think, the idea that you bring up on hunting as being familiar with violence, the cutting of the hide, the hanging of the body. You're seeing death, you're seeing blood. And also, too, in the past, if you're doing more manual labor, you got more cuts in your hands. You're getting more, worn out. You're feeling your bones break. You're feeling there is
the strength of your
body as well, indeed. And we've become increasingly more of an inner people. We're in our heads. We're online. We're using our bodies less. We are much more sedentary, which means we have our mental and existential challenges are greater, arguably, even if we're not physically challenged so much. What's interesting to think that I think Freud is suggesting is that when you have there is something about connection with violence, physical activity in different things that somehow addresses our psychological state, our mental state, and that if we're not carrying that out, it builds up and can cause certain trouble, because we don't have a ventilation system. So it's interesting to think, because you hear the word violence, you can just think, oh, it's, like going to war, killing each other. And you mentioned we're in a less violent age. And that's the Pinker, Steven Pinker thesis in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, that some people challenge. But I think when you bring up this point of violence for hunting, violence in childbirth, I mean, you would be more familiar with all the blood and the experience of that we're not familiar with that anymore. So there could be a kind of alienation with our bodies, and just the idea of how fragile it is, that you can literally just cut your finger open and it will bleed. You can literally hit your hand on something and it will break. There might be something to us that's off if we're not familiar with that level of fragility, that level of possible brokenness.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And I think so Javier Rivera listened to it. He shared some really great thoughts too in response. And one of the things he brought up was about Slavoj Zizek, how he said something along the lines of how, if you have like an aggressive father who just says, you have to do this and that, that can feel oppressive, but at the same time it's almost if you had to choose one over the other, it's better than emotional manipulation, like the father who emotionally manipulates a child or whatever, a family member into doing this or that, because that's actually less favorable in a way, because it's less direct, it's less it's not as easy to identify, right, that it's wrong or that it's doing something wrong to the person. And I was thinking about just the physical analogy. It's like, yeah, is it rough? Is it hard to look at if you have some sort of like laceration on the skin? Sure. Yes. But you know what to do with the wound, for the most part. You know what to do with the wound. It's hard to deal with, things that are internal wounds that end up, unfortunately, sometimes being chronic. If we just think about this from a health perspective, much harder to know what to do with those, how to heal them, and so I think that's interesting, because like you're saying, as we've gone into the internal, now we have I think there's more work that has to be done, because it's harder to sometimes know how to fix the internal wounds than the physical ones. Not that one is like asking for physical wounds, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, it's more linear. I mean, you have a cut, you put you put something, you put a bandage on it. If you have a manipulative father, what do? You never talk to him again. You talk to him and try to change how he acts. You try to empathize with him. It's much more complex. Right. And it's funny, because I was even just thinking as you said that, it's like in the past, if you hunted an animal, well, you know where it came from. You prepared it. You know if it's good or bad for you. You know what comes from. But now you got to do all this like research to figure out if the fruit is organic or if the meat, what was the cow eating. It can almost be more difficult to have confidence that the food you're eating is good for you from the store, where maybe in the past it was a little easier to believe that it had a good source because you got it yourself, and it wasn't, and you didn't inject it with all of these hormones or anything, so you knew it was good. So even regarding food, there might be more existential uncertainty.
Oh, 100%, 100%. I think that it's almost like, so something two things really quick. One could say like, well, okay, if a father's aggressive, like, I don't know, because I'd have to ask Rivera a little bit more on this exact point exactly.
Sure.
But I don't think it was like some verbally abusive father in terms of aggressive. He just meant simply a father who is very direct, who says, you're going to visit your your grandfather at 4 p.m. Like, and maybe that seems harsh and like unyielding, and but that's better. That's better than somebody saying like, well, a father saying, well, if you were a good son, you would visit him, your grandfather, but I'm not going to make you, but you'd really be like, I mean, I would never make that type of choice, where there's this, again, emotional manipulation. It's almost like it's better for the person to be direct, and even if they are kind of like stern with it, it's like, it's very clear to know, it's like, well, could there be internal wounding there, like, or some sort of like trauma, I don't know, maybe, but it's at least it's just because the person wasn't being very nice, right? Even if it's your father, you could say,
you don't have to be mean by being direct.
Exactly, exactly. So aggressive didn't really mean it in the.
But it often, means. I mean, but even if a person is mean and direct, that still is arguably better than emotionally manipulative.
Right, because the emotionally manipulative is like, it's going to come on so saccharine and so sweet, and it's a sugar coating.
You don't know what's solid.
You're not sure. Solid. You're like, I think the person's being nice, but like then it ends up being that they're only trying to achieve something with that niceness, and that's harder to pin down because you're kind of like, you feel, it's harder to trust. Whereas if the person's just mean, you're like, well, they're just mean.
Yeah,
you just know that they're just not being very nice. They could have been kinder. They could have said it in a nicer way, or been maybe direct, but not, like loud or mean about it. So anyways, I just wanted to clarify that on that. But the other thing too is that something I brought up in the talk was about how there's a type of carrying and releasing in violence, and what's interesting is if you think about hunting, it's a very exact moment. Violence has this carrying and releasing, and there's a very precise moment. Just like with birth, right? There's a precise moment when the baby is born. It's a very, very distinct thing, as I can, experientially say from childbirth, having given birth to children, and it's a very exact moment. And when you think about hunting, you hunt. Let's say it's a buck, then you carry that. You have to be the one to carry it, to where you want it to take it. There's something I think that used to be a lot more tied together with the blood, and then you carrying it. Like you carry the child after you birth the child.
Sure.
You take care of it. Now, sure, you would say like, well, you're not going to, the buck's dead now. Like it's a completely different thing.
But there's a bearing.
But there's a bearing there, and I think that, now we just have such a we're so out of touch with what things weigh. You know what I mean? Like what the weight of things. Is it weighty? Is it not? You used to know if a buck was heavy or not. Now, like, your burden, it's in your head. So it could be something that's like a
Scope.
feather is like could be like, in your mind you've made it to be a ton of bricks, or vice versa. It's actually something that's a ton of bricks that now feels like a feather.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, mental problems are harder. They necessarily present themselves with a vividness. Like, if you think people are mad at you, it's the end of the world or something. You can't weigh it, and you can't even determine if it's real. Whereas a buck that you've shot, you go and you lift, you can feel the weight. You can then say, okay, it's 300 pounds. I need to go get the tractor, so you know what to do because you can weight it, you can figure out a solution, or crew, whatever. You can get a solution relative to that actual weight. And then also arguably, if there's a sense in which you get a sense of the weight of what it takes to make food possible. The gravity per se of what it takes. Like now there's just food in the store and you can just kind of forget how incredible it is that it's there, and people are being reminded of that now with the supply chain issue. But with when you actually go and do the work yourself, there's a real sense of, there's a lot to this. There's a lot that goes into this. And it's interesting to think of how violence seems to have some, alluding back to Freud, some sort of psychological ventilation system potentially. There's also something about it where violence is so clear cut to what you're saying. You kill the animal, now the animal is dead. You know what to do. You know the situation. You need to go get a crew because it weighs a certain amount, and then once you do that, you need to skin it. There's this sense. There's something about violence simplifying. There's something about violence sort of breaking through complexity, and it also violence entails decision. Like there's a radical decision that you've made. You have killed this animal. You are responsible for it. And now you must do something about it. So one of the reasons we can actually perhaps turn to complexity is because then you can't locate responsibility. It's not so clearly you who's responsible. Say if you're part of a big firm, it's the firm that's responsible. We talk about the government, the firm, work, these kind of disembodied things. But there's something about the act of violence that is you hunted, or this is your baby that you've birthed into the world, or this is the food that you've prepared, or you went to war and attacked that enemy. You shot at that German or that Japanese, that is you. So there's something radically responsible, which almost suggests that we need feelings of being responsible for things, and yet we hate being responsible for things because we want to run from them. It suggests that we need simplicity, but we also hate seeing situations clearly. We want to be able to deny them. So there's this interesting, and that just gets into why Freud is in fact a kind of dialectical thinker in the tradition of Hegel and different things, because there's this bothness where we want simplicity because we want to see things clearly, because when we don't see things clearly, we're existentially overwhelmed. But then just as soon as we see things clearly, we don't like it, and we don't like what we've seen. So there's this interesting back and forth we tend to carry out in our psyche.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think, carry out, like, this funny you use that language, because I was thinking, and I was going to maybe do something separate on it, but it's a pretty simple point. I think it would be very good to bring in here, because I was thinking about just that. People would carry more children. They would carry their food, their like literally just bags of rice, and if you harvested things, you're carrying stuff. You're carrying your buck that you hunted. You're carrying. There's so much more carrying.
Sure.
And I think now we carry a weight of something that is emotional. We carry a weight of something that's existential. We don't carry as much with our own hands, two hands, And
that's interesting too, because no one else can carry your mental weight. Whereas if you were coming up through the field carrying a buck, people could see it. Jim could come. Jim could come and weigh it, and he could say, "Oh man, that weighs 200 pounds. A good 200 pounds there." And you can go, "Yeah, 200 pounds." You can share. It can be observed. But your mental weight, no one else can observe.
And maybe you yourself cannot. You
yourself.
It's weird, and like I think that's to the point where you're saying about this kind of strange, like we want it, we don't want it. Like we kind of want to feel like we can define that weight in our mind, and yet we don't even know for sure.
No. No.
So it's this weird oscillating place of like we know it, we don't know, we want to know,
the
we
weight
don't want to know.
Given.
Yeah,
it's
about the weightiness of whatever it is that we actually have in our mental, field, if you will.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting as well, because if we're talking about the hunting example, there's this idea that with an act of violence, you can kind of finish the task. It's kind of done. But you can't carry out an act of violence on yourself, without like that being suicide or something. And actually, if you do violence on yourself, you devolve into kind of mental illness and all these different problems, depression and sadness and different things.
Yeah.
So there's no way when your goals are more external to you, like the places that you're directing your violence, it can be carried out and kind of ventilated in a sense. Whereas in the modern world, where you're the source of the problem, if you will, exactly. Mostly, then the violence is directed to yourself, and it's not a ventilation system, but a system of self-destruction.
Yeah, and that's what I bring up in the talk. I get to the point of it, we have now it can become a bloodless violence on ourselves.
Yes.
And on our relationships too. I think that happens too, where people, because of that wrestling or war, if you even want to say, with yourself, then it can also spill over. To other people, to relationships, because I think there's almost like, I don't know, maybe it's just a kind of a venting of that.
Sure.
And I think perhaps in the past there was a greater, there's a sadness in having to hunt the animal.
Sure.
And yet there's a necessity to it as well. Mm. If we're talking, 1800s, like, sure. This is survival in the winter. Like, what are you going to do? You can't even just grow things, you'd have to hunt. You'd have to.
Sure.
I mean, maybe not if you're in a different climate or something, right. Like that. But if we're talking about, like, I don't know, New England or something like right. That, maybe we could fish. But I mean, the thing is that it's like a sad, but a sacramental type of, and that's another thing Javier brought up. You said how, like, people used to just have the animal was sacrificed.
Oh yeah.
As like there was something ritualistic about that, and even like in a moment to just thank God, whoever you believed sure. Gave this provision for you, and you would have that moment before in its death, and then you would eat it, and there was also this mourning, but also a celebration, because then it does sustain your life too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we've totally lost touch with that.
Well, it makes me think one of the problems can be when you have a society that is not encountering death, like you've never seen a dead animal.
Yeah.
Then blood, violence, death, all these things are abstractions to you.
Yeah.
And by not encountering the sadness of it and the guilt of it, you mm-hmm. ended this mm-hmm. animal's life, for example, and yet you had to. So there's this sense of tragedy, this sense of trade-offs that you mm-hmm. cannot avoid. Well, if you don't have personal experiences with that, then that may result in a people who are more willing to flirt with, as a society, flirting with World War III, flirting with tearing down institutions, flirting with not really taking seriously some of the consequences that can emerge on a large scale if you don't have your economy operating in the right way and cause a certain bubble to collapse, which sets off a series of geopolitical events that causes a massive problem. There could be something here as well. And also, too, if you're not, the example of eating an animal, you hate to kill, but you also have to eat. There's a tragedy there. Well, Martha, we've spoken about it before. Martha Nussbaum discusses how we've lost the category of tragedy,
right?
Which is a trade-off of competing goods. We think now today in terms of problems and solutions. Yeah. Well, in an age where violence is part of life, well, then violence is part of life. Yeah. There's a trade-off there. Life entails violence against life.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like, and I think perhaps though again, there's many benefits to being in a time and age that we live in. But one of the things that maybe we've lost touch with is this strange relationship that's like you're saying necessary.
Yes.
With violence.
Yes.
But really for the sake of life itself.
Yes.
Life yes. and death. It's they're very linked together in violence in its more abstract sense, because we're also talking about birth. We're talking about the bloodiness, these kind of death to life moments. And I wonder if now, like, again, it depends on what climate or sure. If you're in the tropics or something, maybe you could be a like complete vegan, perhaps. Sure. Even sure. Maybe you could eat just really sure. literally sure. only eat plants. Sure. But I do wonder now if it can be even more offensive, possibly, like, even it's a whole nother topic. And I told Javier, I was like, I really should dig into this myself a bit more on just even like there's just so much more to learn there for me personally. I know you've done already a lot of research on this, but on the topic of what you consume and animals, not animals, sure. et cetera. But the point is that it could be even, like, I think with a lot of the violences that we're talking about that people were more close to in the past, today there can be a, like, well, you don't have to.
Sure.
And I mean, you can see this even like, with childbirth, like
Sure.
epidurals, etc.
Sure.
People
It's more options.
people often like kind of feel like, well, it's if that's available, why wouldn't you use that?
Oh, sure.
And
Sure.
I mean, for people who choose not to, then it can almost be like, well, why are you kind of getting so in touch with this kind of primal? Because in childbirth, there's a very primal,
Sure.
Roar of the mother that's
Yes.
birthing. It's a very painful but beautiful experience, and I think that's you can kind of feel the pressure of the arguments of like, well, that's fine for the people in the 1800s, but we don't have to do that now.
Well, but this is where what Freud, as I understand it, this is what Freud is pointing out, is that indeed it becomes rational not to do these do these things, to not, it becomes rational to take an epidural, to not eat meat, and so on and so forth. But indeed, if there is something about the human psyche that needs experiences of violence somehow, precisely in order to take violence seriously, then you really need to kind of understand that where doing these things might have some positive impact on us due to something on a subconscious level that we can't fully articulate, that if we don't do, there's going to be a problem.
We kind of shift somewhere, right? Like,
yeah.
What does that mean? Is that better?
Yeah, rational is always relative to the true. So if you've never read Freud, for example, then everything those people are saying, is rational. Why would you do it, right? Especially if you accept premises like pain doesn't have any value to it, right? Pain is a problem to be solved, et cetera, et cetera. But you see, if Freud is correct, then part of the issue is that when you don't have a society that has any encounters with violence, it becomes complacent about violence. It becomes complacent about problems, and it doesn't address them, and then things get pent up, and then you have a real disaster.
Yeah. And the thing is, here you have this like like I was saying, like the laceration that's very superficial. You know what to do with it. It hurts really badly, but you see it, right? You see it. It's very vivid to you.
Yes.
The things that become internal wounds, whether they're like in the body as a chronic thing or systemically. See, because then I think that the risk potentially, I'm not saying like we all necessarily have to go back to hunter gatherers, but we can learn from them though. The thing is that then the violence can become systemic. Like I think there are some very horrendous things that can happen in animal.
Sure.
In
processing meat and all
exactly.
that. Yes.
There can be for certain. I mean, you'd have to get into really the specifics of where and how, and you can't say everyone is doing that necessarily, but you can't be blind to the fact that unfortunately sometimes it does happen.
Of course.
And so I think that's why I think hunting, to me personally, in terms of an experience with like having to eat an animal is in some ways a very fair fight. It's like I would never condone like treating animals badly or doing anything to harm them in a way that like torture them or hurt them. The thing is the hunting is, and I don't know, I think I grew up being from South Africa, my grandfather, they were very big into riflery and hunting is a big deal for them. But they took the animals right back to their own home and they butchered it. They knew how to do everything to make the meats and be able to preserve those meats for long periods of time, for it to sustain for the rest of the winter or the year. But the thing is like there's something that kind of feels man to man about hunting. You respect the animal and you realize that it is like it's this chase, like that's why it's a hunt. And I think there's something kind of fair about I mean it's tragic, yes, but there's something like you could even say like to raise animals to kill them is almost less fair than even a hunt, because at least there was a chance, like there was a chance for them to be able to get away. And again, it's not a pleasant idea, but still I think there's something like it makes me think of like how there's a chance there to, you have to kind of earn your bread, if you will.
There's risk.
There's a risk, and there's a risk for you as a hunter, and there's a risk as the animal itself, and I think it's not a given. You have to kind of put yourself out there more so.
Every time you hunt,
to be able to do it, and I think that's why we can learn something from a hunter-gatherer society and the hunting that we're talking about here.
Well, every time, especially in older civilizations, every time you go to hunt, there is no guarantee you'll come back alive.
Exactly.
Basically, there's a guarantee if you go to a food line, you're going to come back to life. If you go to the grocery store, you're going to be fine. But there is no guarantee. Yeah. If you go
and there's
to hunt.
no guarantee you would be bringing anything back.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Arguably, it could perhaps give a civilization where it's easier to be more grateful. You know, if you see childbearing and you know how hard it is, and you know how likely it is for the mother to pass or to die in older civilizations, and if she doesn't die and the child is born healthy, you know, it may be easier to be appreciating that as opposed to wondering why you don't have more Facebook accounts. You know, you know, encountering the primal dimensions of life may do something to help one appreciate and focus on the things that matter. That's one part of it. Precisely because, again, like you're saying, strange enough, when it's easy to have a full refrigerator, it's hard to really understand how extraordinary that is.
Oh yeah.
In the history of the human race.
Oh, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's just once you
it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it becomes commonplace, and instead you're sad about Facebook followers or something. Not to belittle existential and mental health issues that can develop due to social, but there's something to be said that perhaps a way that one could better balance their focus on their status on Facebook or the internet would be encounters with the real, in terms of the primal and the violent, where if you go out and work a garden and you're, you know, working on that may help keep things in perspective. Sure. About YouTube and Facebook and one's celebrity status or stuff like that. Not to say those things don't matter and that they're inherently bad to pursue, but there does to be some kind of balancing that it could help with.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is great, and it can't be understated. We you know, gratitude is such an elixir. I think in many respects, it's really helpful because it's easy to get, you know, stuck in one's head or whatever, stuck in their circumstance. And when you have a perspective and that gratitude, then you realize, like, wow, you know, there's actually, you know, that actually frees me up to actually, like, you know, use this energy instead of using it to be, you know, sad or depressed. I could be creative and make something myself, you know. So even just to take a minute to really, like, reflect and understand what those before us went through, could do, their capacity, and why they did what they did, I think is so important, because then you can understand a little bit more about, like, why it is, like you said, actually a very, like, miraculous thing to be able to just go to the store and pick something up and bring it home.
Yeah, and in addition to Thanksgiving, I think all you know, when we talk about violence, when we talk about you know, the hunt, the physical, all of this is kind of on the physical, like taking seriously the body, taking seriously the physical. I mean, the other thing that can happen is if you don't have those encounters with the real, I guess, then you actually, it becomes more difficult to age gracefully, I think, in some respects, because, you know, if you really take your body seriously and you know that it's going to break down, because nature consists of things breaking down, then you prepare for that. You accommodate yourself for that. You're aware of the realities of health, and those don't destabilize you so much, and you're also ready for death around you. But if you're always online, nothing dies online.
Right,
no one gets unhealthy online, you know, and and also nobody, you know, nobody has bipolar, you know, or Alzheimer, or these different sicknesses. Of course, they do in their real lives, but there is a lack of familiarity with the real. That then I think it actually makes it could be more difficult to gracefully age and other things like that, or to handle the people around you going through different situations that they're going through.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think just being in touch with that is always, I mean, you know, I think it's funny because being out here on the farm, you know, you plant something and you're very excited about it, and then, you know,
it dies. Or the deer eats it. They ate all the kale. I've never seen
I know, it's crazy.
They never eat that. What the heck?
I'd see another. It's like, it just, there's nothing like living out.
Well, they commit, the animals do a violence against you.
Exactly.
You know, right? They destroy your fence, and, you know, there's a kind of violence to nature as well.
Exactly. And I think you know, if you want to get in touch with the fragility and the fleetingness of life, you go stick yourself out in the country and plant something. I mean, basically, and you'll really be in touch really quick with, like, oh, wait, that's not there anymore.
Well, there's a way in which nature feels a lot like trading forces, like forces trading back and forth. You know, the storm blew away your barn, the storm won one, and you went out and put it back up, and you fought back, or, you know, the deer ate your kale, and
now you're hunting
the kale. Well, there's a kind of, it's not even a good, like, the categories of good and evil don't really fit. It's just like these forces sort of trading. Yeah. And that helps you, I do think, in terms of flow, you know, in terms of accommodating, you know, not going, how do I solve this problem? No, this is not a problem you solve. This is a problem you manage and live with. It's called nature. But again, when you're not in the situations where you have to encounter these quote unquote violent realities, I do think it's easier to fall into the technological thinking of everything being problem and solutions, and then everyone becomes technocrats, and then that falls into all the mistakes that Heidegger talks about of turning nature into a giant machine and all that different. Tolkien speaks about it, and all the stuff that does to us.
Yeah. One thing I want to really bring up really quick on that I did bring up in the talk was just about how, like, I've always thought, I was like, oh, poor vegetables, because like whenever I'm cooking, so I was like, okay, chop, slice, peel, this is like what you do to the poor carrots and onions and things like that. But it's funny because I always, as much as I certainly appreciate, don't get me wrong, I certainly appreciate being able to just like go pick up food or go to a restaurant. There's something about when I make something with my own two hands that just feels more nourishing. I don't know if it just makes me think about when my mother prepared food, grandmother prepared foods and things. But there's something about, I do wonder, it's literally like being in touch with the real, like you're saying, with what you are going to consume.
Sure.
There's like the physical act of just touching all these little pieces of onion that you're scooping into the, you scoop up and then you like drop into the warm oil or whatever. And it's just, I just think there's something about that just, it's, convenience is certainly helpful sometimes for sure. But, the actual convening with the thing you're going to ingest, to me, is like part of the it makes it part of the nourishment.
It's interesting to think that the majority of foods you would never touch unless you cook them. A hot dog you would touch, yes. A taco you would touch, yes. But the majority of foods you would never touch, like a soup, because you use like a fork or a knife or whatever. So it's kind of interesting to think, as you were talking, I was just kind of reflecting on the idea that most foods, like, you never touch them, you never handle them unless you cook them. And it just goes straight to your mouth most of the time. It just goes straight into your stomach. It goes straight into your internal self.
If you're Mr. Civilized Daniel, with your knives and forks, and just barbarically like scooping these out
Fair
with my
enough.
hand.
If Garfield knows lasagna well.
Well, but there are some cultures where, you've got like non-bread, you've got like these types of breads that basically become like.
But the more westernized it becomes, those
sure.
cultures are also the ones that are probably more familiar with everything we're describing, nature and violence and so on and so forth. But as there's a movement toward industrialization,
that is a good point. You're basically like, it's on the floor. It's very, there's almost like a instrumental
sterilization of the food.
like almost like you're doing a surgery with like these silver little tools,
and it just goes straight to your mouth.
Yep, straight to the
there's
mouth.
there's no handling it in any other way, and certainly that could have an impact on it. And likewise, if we tie this, in modern society, basically the only time you handle violence is domestic violence, or going too far, or war, or stuff like that. You're not having violence. You're not ever handling violence in a way that isn't going too far.
Exactly.
In the same way that you're never handling food today, except in the context of eating it and consuming it. And what's very problematic is if you have an entire society on a collective level that doesn't have experiences with violence, well, then it can be almost a kind of unknown, a kind of uncharted territory, a sort of area where, like, oh, we haven't tried that yet, we haven't explored that yet, and there can be an idea of, well, let's do it. Maybe that will solve all the tribalism that's going on. Maybe that will solve all the marital problems. Maybe what we need is some kind of violent revolution or something. And then the problem is, so then you try it, but then of course you can't go back, right? And the problem is, whereas when you hunt a deer and you're like, oh, I killed this animal, and you feel bad about it, and you see the pain, and you feel the suffering, and you kind of like, well, maybe I shouldn't be so quick to do this. Maybe I should be a vegetarian because this is really hard. If you have an entire society of people that aren't really familiar with violence, well, then they'll be willing to try it on a very, very large, they may be willing to try it on a very large scale, and then the consequences will be extremely dire, and then they'll see it and be like, oh, this was not a good idea, but now it's too late. Right. And maybe that's the story of something like the French Revolution or different things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that the term came up from Gerard, and the scapegoat, the concept of that, and, that's a very funny term, right? Because like scapegoat, it would have usually been an actual animal.
Sure.
Now it can become swaths of a population or a person or, it does seem like because we don't, it's strange. It's almost like there can be this violence in a ostracizing sense, in an extractive sense.
Yes.
That's done almost as a placeholder. If it's not, if there are not these like violence that leads to life type of being in touch with those types of violences that led to life, right?
Yeah, and I mean and also just to add, like you were talking about cooking, like if you're like, oh, you use a knife to cook, you're like, you're getting in your knife use quota.
Literally, that's and I know it seems so basic, but if we're talking about Freud, we're talking about the primal, we're talking about these things that are hard to even articulate, but there's something that, and that's what I mean. It's like this very strange thing of when I'm cooking.
Yes.
I got my knife time in. Like, I got to use my knife, basically.
And the problem is, if you have a society that doesn't do that, they still have the itch to get their knife time to use a knife, and then they use it on their spouse, or they use it on a person, or they use it in a war, and that's what ends up happening, because they don't have the space to get their knife time in at the kitchen table. As silly as that sounds, but that in the same way that if the whole society does not have functions of getting familiar with death, of encountering death, or encountering blood. There's this funny idea that life is blood. Well, that means blood is life. And so that's a very paradoxical statement, right? We've been talking about this connection between life and blood. Exactly. There's be no life without blood.
Yes,
there would be no human beings. It's very strange.
Yes.
It's, blood is usually, you hear the word blood and you recoil because you think about someone bleeding.
Yeah.
So right there, life is deeply connected with something that we associate quite quickly with violence. And basically the sight of blood is always a sign of violence. If you are seeing blood, some sort of violence has occurred. Someone is in the hospital with a cut. Someone has been stabbed. There is the baby is pushing out. There is some sort of violence. Like, if blood is visible, a violence is happening.
Well, I think this is very interesting, and gosh, there's probably a lot more symbolism to get into potentially here. But the female seems to be like a very, very interesting embodiment of this like unwounded blood. That I talk about, this like one little poem I did, but it's like it's a very interesting concept because a baby being born is in a way traumatic physically, but it's also like it's this incredible moment of new life, and you're not really like, you are interested, but it's not like you got, it's not like somebody came up with a machete and like trying to cut your arm off or something. It's very interesting. The woman seems to hold this space for the unwounded blood.
Yes.
And so it's I think that even just to be, I think for females to be in touch with their own body, their own cycle, all of that, there's something about that there that we have a reminder. The female has a bloody reminder.
But that may
her
hint,
flesh.
But that may hint at why men are more likely
to draw blood.
Yeah, to draw blood, and to go too far. They're not getting any connection with the primal, and so then they want to tear stuff down. And
you don't have people fighting, like just having kind of rough and tumble fights and stuff, like boys and young men having that, like that seems to be a place to kind of get that out.
Where the woman has a cycle of releasing blood, men have to draw blood.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's kind of, and then if you have an overly masculine society, or then you have a society of men pent up who are upset, then that kind of, alluding to Freud, that could have an entire society of people that are looking for an experience of drawing blood, which then gets you into World War III, or gets you into tearing down institutions that are very difficult to bring back. So there's this idea that's interesting, this idea of the female becomes a way to get your blood quota without drawing it. It just naturally comes out, where otherwise you have to draw it. Yeah. And what seems to be a major problem is, in older civilizations, you'd have encounters with blood by killing the animal. You would have more encounters with violence and different things, and now you don't, but people still want to see it on a subconscious level. They still want to encounter death. Well,
go to the movies. Maybe.
Yeah, basically. Well, and, maybe that's why violent films are popular, but they want to take it to the next level. And so then you have societies that are on the verge of like all-out civil war and revolution, and once you do that, it's very, very difficult to go back.
And maybe there can also be like though nobody would want to admit it, it's almost like we're getting our scapegoating, like we're finally kind of like there can be almost in a very primal sense, you do it for all of the justice reasons and all of the good for humanity reasons, but really it's kind of like a primal release.
Yeah, and as
on
I'm
the
saying
scapegoat.
this, it now comes to mind that horror series, The Purge, which is basically about one day a year where there was no laws and people were allowed to murder and do whatever, and for the rest of the year, it's like utopia because they had their one night of The Purge. So that's
Wow,
coming
sounds
to
so
mind.
fun.
So maybe Freud would like that. I don't know. But
yeah.
the element though that movie series probably does not capture, I would not know, is that the idea that you have this problem is that, so if we have this idea that life is blood, and the only way to see blood is to make someone bleed, unless it's the feminine element, or make yourself bleed. Well, there's this interesting idea that in order to get what you want, you have to draw blood, but the moment you draw blood, you're like, oh gosh, I wounded somebody. So there's this moment of terror that opens up the second you get what you want, which then you have two ways to respond to it. Just go deeper into it so you don't think about the fact that you're now wounding someone, or you recoil in horror and you change your ways. But there's this kind of moment where the violent act occurs against your fellow man, where there's a feeling of, oh gosh, what have I done? Where you're just, it's kind of like this Pandora's box kind of thing, where you want life to feel alive, so that means you need blood. But the moment you make someone bleed, you've lost the thing that you want. It loses it, and it becomes a kind of terror to you.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of the dialectic, this kind of tragic move that seems to kind of build up, where a society that doesn't have these rituals, if you want to call them that, these processes of familiarity with violence, where they can, on a small level, have that revelation moment occur, where they, they're like, oh, they're so excited to shoot a gun. You have all those stories of the boys so excited to go hunting, and then they hunt, and there's just like, oh gosh, and they see the animal in pain, and they're like, goodness, what is this? But then they also realize they have to eat, so you get this kind of, but it's on a small scale. The problem is, if you don't have those ways to do it on a small scale, then it just builds up, and the only way it can happen is on a big scale. Well, now now the society's over, or now you can't learn from it. At least if you go hunting, you can learn the lesson of violence without it being final, in a sense, without it being fatal. But now you have a situation where you can't do it without it being fatal.
Right. Well, fatal to the animal, but not fatal
or
to
to
humanity.
the society.
Oh, to the society, yeah.
Yeah, as a whole. And that would be the primal call of our baby. So this has been OG Rose. For more,
for more, follow us on Instagram
and
Twitter, Anchor.
And this is nature.
YouTube. This is